So before we start creating our print ad for our restaurant, I would like to share with you some design principles for creating print documents using graphic design. If you were in my classroom, you'd see that I have posters for each of the concepts that we'll go over today. But looking at this just online, you'll be able to see some examples as we go through that will help you understand a little bit better how these principles are applied. So the 5 principles that we're using for graphic design are contrast, alignment, repetition, proximity, and emphasis. And those seem like big words, but don't worry about it. As we go along, you'll see some examples. This creates an acronym called CARPE. CARPE is Latin for seize. Maybe you've heard this phrase, carpe diem, which means seize the day. But today we're going to be seizing the design. We're going to go through each of these principles, looking at some tips as well as examples so that you can see. Now notice I'm not going through them in the order of the acronym. I'm going through them in the order that I think is easiest to understand. The first concept is alignment. Alignment is how you place objects on the page, and we've talked about alignment with your business card. To align objects on the page, we want to create structure by aligning them to the left or the right, the top or the bottom, but centering generally is something that we want to avoid. Here's an example of a document that has a lot of different elements in it. And at first glance, you may not notice it, but if you start going along, look down this left-hand edge here, and you're going to notice that there's a lot of misaligned objects coming over here. This is not aligned. And just basically the objects on the page, including like the author's name here, just haphazardly placed. We want to create a strong alignment. Easily done. The easy rule to remember for alignment is if you don't know where to put something, just line it up with something else. Here's a corrected version. You notice they've moved the author name over to the right, here down here at the right. This graphics down here at the bottom to the left. Everything here is lined up on the left except for this drop cap, which works to catch your eye to tell you where to begin reading. So it's not lined up, but there's a reason for that, and it serves a purpose. And misaligned documents are just sloppy. You may not be able to see it right off the bat, but they'll seem haphazard and unorganized. And the first rule of alignment is to create structure. Here's some business cards. The one at the bottom looks closer to what we were looking at with a strong right alignment, rather than just placing things all over the page, in this case a card. By aligning this text over to the right, creates a gutter between the graphic and this text, and rather than centering this caption, we moved over to the left, getting everything brought to the middle and keeping it structured together. The next graphic design concept is repetition. Don't worry if I'm going too fast. There'll be a copy of this slideshow that you can look at your own pace. But you don't have to memorize these things, but just kind of understand the concept. Repetition means to repeat. And for our case in graphic design, that means to keep like things alike. There's no reason to change the font, change the color, or change where things is just because you can. We want to keep things consistent and change them when we need to. We want to create unity across our document. So when we're using a font for our, say, body type, we want to use that for all of the body type. If I'm doing a menu for my restaurant, all of the headings should be the same font. All of the menu items should be the same font. So here's an example of using a same font. Now, one thing to be careful of, you look here, and this actually has repetition maybe to a fault. Not only is the body type all the same font, that's good, it has to have that repetition. All of the headings, although some of them are bolded and different size, use the same font. Repetition does not mean everything has to be exactly the same. Here, we're repeating the font for the body text and repeating a different font for the headings. That kind of takes us into the next concept, which is contrast. So repetition and contrast work with one another. While in repetition we keep like things alike, in contrast we make different things different. So you need to separate objects from one another. In the previous example, those headings stood out because they used a thicker font that was consistent among the headings but different from the body type. Create visual interest on your page. Draw attention to the items on the page. If you're thinking about your print ad, What's the most important thing on your print ad? How can you draw attention to it? So here again, we have repetition, we have alignment, but here's a bolder version, one where we take this rectangle at the top, we make the text reversed out into white, really stands out a lot more, and again, we have these headings that are a lot heavier, and we repeat the font, so all of the headings have the same font. That's important, but they're different from the body text, and that gives us contrast. Here's a resume, which is used to apply for a job, tells you about yourself, and again, there's repetition here. It's all the same, but it's all kind of bland too. If we add in some lines and some different fonts, we can make things stand out. You can also see how the titles of the job positions that this person had is also standing out because of that repetition of that heavier font. Here's an example of a flyer, and you can see there's a lot of text here. It doesn't have repetition, yes. Alignment, probably not. But what it lacks is any sort of contrast. It all just kind of runs together. Notice in the fixed version how much bigger the graphic is. A graphic is going to be used to draw attention. In your print ad, you need to pick a graphic that's going to represent your event. Whew. This is all over the place. Nothing worse than some sort of a border going around to detract you from the message. We want to use graphics to draw attention to what our message is, not to take away from it. It's just kind of a mess with all of these stars and everything centered, and there's no separation of content. A much cleaner example gives us 1, we see the heading, the title at the top. 2, we see this phone number down here at the bottom. And 3, we might see the information here. Graphics still here. It's been incorporated into the title, and this line has been used to help separate the content. We use a line here and white space here. That gets us into the next concept, which is proximity, is about grouping like things together. How do we group things together? Well, in order to group them together, we need to separate them, and we often separate them with white space. We are going to organize information for the reader. Here's an example of a garage sale flyer. I often ask my students, what do you want to know about a garage sale? Well, you probably want to know, when is it? Where is it? What time is it? And then what the items are for sale. All of that information is included in here, but we can't see it because nothing's been organized. Somebody played around with this and thought they were having fun, but it really just confuses the reader. All the same information is included, but we have this grouping. Here's what it is, when it is, and where it is. Here's a list of all of the items, and here's a little teaser to get you to come over there with the free coffee and donuts. And at the bottom, we also say proceeds go to. Some of you might choose to do some sort of a fundraiser for your event. You don't necessarily need to put who the proceeds go to right off the bat. That can be down at the bottom and small. White space, 1, 2, 3 sections on the page, we have proximity. No proximity here, it's just one giant page of text. We're asking the reader to go through here. How many concerts are there? No idea, because it's just too much to go through, and it's not even aligned. Now I can see 1, 2, 3. We've grouped all of the concerts informations together. Here's some other information down here at the bottom. Notice how the graphic is much larger to emphasize what's going on with this piano concert series, and it's also used to grab attention. Do we have repetition? Yes, we have the same font being used for my headings, and we have a strong left alignment here. The final graphic design principle is emphasis, and this goes along with contrast. As you start working through these principles, you'll notice that they work together. Not each individual one do you need to focus on. It just kind of, as you move through your document, realize that, hey, I need to have emphasis, and maybe I get that by creating good alignment, and then I add contrast, and I add repetition to go with structure with my alignment, and then maybe contrast a font or color to emphasize something. But you need to have something to emphasize on your document. You should think about a hierarchy for your print ad. What's the most important thing? What's the second most important thing? What's the third most important thing? Those should be obvious to the reader. If you tell me the most important thing is what your event is, but you bury that in a small font in the bottom of the page, I'm not going to see it. Most oftenly, we read from top to bottom, left to right. So most important items typically go at the top. Least important items generally go at the bottom. Whew! What's with the chili peppers? I mean, this thing is just a mess. And by the way, all caps should never be used for body text. Not only does it mean shouting, it's very slow to read. So we have this graphic, but these chili peppers aren't doing anything, and there's no grouping in here whatsoever. You can see now this is a very common way of organizing. You might use this for your print ad. Left align objects at the top, right align objects at the bottom. You get kind of this angled white space through here, and there's a little bit more small information down at the bottom. Information's been grouped into 1, 2, 3 paragraphs here. You can see that it's a much cleaner use of the space. Woof. There's a lot going on here. Think about alignment, proximity, what can we group together? We have some repetition, but then there's some weird things down at the bottom. There's a lot going on here, but you're asking the reader to try and figure out what's the event, what's going on. We need to pull those things out, emphasize them using contrast. I don't need to delete any of the information on here, but I do need to put it into a hierarchy. I need to prioritize it for my reader. So here's one possible solution. Now, Woof is the logo of this dog bakery, and they repeat that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 throughout. It's an interesting use. I like how this little F descender breaks below this line, as does the dog picture come down and how the W kind of comes in here. That helps bring all of this together as a consistent graphic. You might think of something like this for your print ad, where you put a rectangle at the top, maybe the name of your event, maybe have a graphic here that breaks down into the rest of your details. Take a Hike, which is the name of the event, is very large. It's toward the top. It stands out. They've also done some things with aligning. But basically, while I wouldn't expect you to come up with something so complicated, you can see how this is much more organized for the reader. So as you take a look at an advertisement like this, it obviously looks like there's a lot of problems. What I want to give you is the language to describe what the problems are and how you might fix it. You might look at alignment first and think about, how could I do things different with alignment? How do I use repetition to create structure with that alignment? And then how do I go and take what I want to emphasize and maybe use some proximity to group those items together? This ad really suffers from a lack of alignment and a lack of repetition. There's just stuff all over the place, and how many fonts? Count the number of fonts that are being used on this. We might just want to get that down to like one body font and one title heading font. What about the graphics on the side? There's a lot going on there. Each one has a lot to it. Maybe we narrow it down to just having one. So there's a lot of information here, and I don't have a worked up version of a solution, something I want you to think about as you're going through. What would you do different to clean this up, to make it more clear? As you're going forward and working on your print ad, I want you to think about these principles as you go and design it. So good luck, and hope you have a good time creating.